The clock on the wall ticked past 11:30 p.m., each sound echoing too loudly in the empty diner. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the linoleum floor and the cracked leather seats of the booths. I leaned on the counter, wiping down a coffee cup for the 5th time, trying to fight the unease that had settled in my chest like a stone. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, stretching thin and taut, ready to snap. The diner had always been quiet at this hour, but tonight the stillness was different, heavier, almost suffocating. I glanced at the windows, where the parking lot lay empty except for my old sedan. Beyond that, darkness swallowed the road, the surrounding trees forming a wall of black that seemed to press closer with every passing second. At exactly midnight, the bell above the door jingled. I jumped, nearly dropping the cup, my heart pounding like a drum. A man stepped inside, tall and gaunt, his face pale and expressionless. He wore a dark coat that looked too heavy for the mild October night. His eyes, flat and hollow, locked onto me as he slowly walked to a booth and sat down. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound casual as I grabbed my notepad. He didn't reply, just continued to stare. His lips didn't move, but it felt as though his gaze whispered something I couldn't understand. A soundless voice brushing against my mind. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Pie?" My voice wavered slightly. Still no response. After a moment, I set the notepad on the counter and returned to wiping the same spotless cup. He didn't order, didn't move, just sat there, hands folded on the table like he was waiting for something. The air felt colder, and I rubbed my arms, glancing at the clock. 12:10. The bell jingled again, and another figure entered. A woman this time, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She walked with stiff, deliberate movements, taking a seat at a booth across the room from the man. Her hands rested on the table, gloved in black leather, unmoving. Like the first man, her eyes were empty, void of any humanity. They didn't acknowledge each other. They didn't look at the menu. They only stared at me. My throat tightened as I moved toward the register, hoping for a distraction, but my fingers trembled as I pretended to count the cash. The two figures remained silent, their unblinking gazes boring into me. 12, 30. The bell rang again, and again. 2 more entered, then 3. By 12:40, 6 people were seated in various booths, all dressed in dark clothing, all staring at me with those same hollow eyes. My breaths came faster, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to call out, force a laugh, anything to break the tension. "Is this some kind of Halloween prank, a flash mob or something?" No one answered. Their stillness felt predatory. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached under the counter for the phone. My fingers brushed it, but before I could dial, the power flickered and went out, plunging the diner into a dim, eerie glow from the emergency lights. The figures moved then. They turned their heads in unison, their blank faces eerily synchronized as they looked toward the counter. My breath hitched and I froze, my hand gripping the phone as though it could save me. One of them stood up. A man near the door. He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table, a folded piece of paper. Then he walked out without a word, the bell jangling behind him. I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity before my legs finally obeyed. I moved slowly, cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My fingers trembled as I picked up the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as though scrawled by an unsteady hand. "We've come for you, don't leave." A chill ran down my spine as I looked up. The remaining 5 figures were no longer seated. They stood now, perfectly still, their heads cocked to the side, watching me. And then, all at once, they began to move. Toward me, the air turned suffocating, thick with a cold that seeped into my bones. I backed away toward the counter as the figures moved closer, their steps synchronized and deliberate. Their hollow eyes reflected the faint emergency lights, giving them an otherworldly glow. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I gripped the counter behind me for support. I reached blindly under it, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers wrapped around the cold steel of a chef's knife and I yanked it free, holding it out in front of me. They didn't stop. Their heads tilted at odd angles, their gazes unblinking as they advanced. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized they weren't walking. They were gliding, their feet barely touching the floor. The bell above the door jingled again, and I whipped my head around, hoping for a normal customer, someone who could help. Instead, another figure entered. This one was different, taller, its outline indistinct, as though it were wrapped in a shroud of smoke. It didn't glide, it hovered, the edges of its form flickering like a dying flame. The moment it entered, the others froze mid-step, their heads snapping toward the door in unison. I took the chance to bolt toward the kitchen. My shoes squeaked on the tiles as I shoved through the swinging door, slamming it shut behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and I pressed my back against the door, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The kitchen felt wrong, too quiet. I glanced around, the stainless steel counters reflecting the dim glow of the emergency lights. My reflection stared back at me wide-eyed and pale. The silence was broken by a faint click-click-click sound, like nails tapping against metal. I spun toward the sound and my stomach dropped. A shadow moved across the far wall, long and spindly, like the limbs of a spider. The tapping grew louder, closer, and my eyes darted around, searching for the source. Then I saw it, a shape scuttling across the ceiling, its movements unnatural and jerky. It was one of them, but its body was contorted, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it crawled overhead. I bit back a scream and ran deeper into the kitchen, knocking over pots and pans as I went. The noise was deafening, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. I spotted the back door, the red glow of the exit sign a beacon of hope. I sprinted toward it, my shoes slipping on the greasy floor. Just as my hand reached the push bar, a figure appeared in the small window of the door, its face pressed against the glass. The eyes were wrong, black pits that seemed to pull the light into them. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as I realized the door was no longer an escape. The tapping resumed, coming from the walls now, from the ceiling, from everywhere. It surrounded me, closing in like a predator circling its prey. I turned, swinging the knife wildly at the air, but there was nothing to hit. A voice cut through the noise, low and distorted, reverberating in my skull. "You can't run," I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice didn't come from the shadows or the figures outside. It came from inside me, a vibration in my chest that made my teeth ache. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadows shifted, and the figure in the door's window disappeared. The others moved, their silhouettes blotting out the light as they pressed against the frosted glass. The distorted voice spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "You took what wasn't yours," my mind reeled. The only thing I had touched tonight was the note, but it couldn't mean that. Could it? "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked as the words spilled out. A sudden knock on the kitchen door made me jump. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The swinging door rattled, and I pressed myself against the counter, clutching the knife like a lifeline. The door creaked open, just an inch, and the cold air rushed in. I stared at the crack, unable to move as the door swung wider. One of the figures stood there, its head tilted to the side, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, splitting its face like a cracked mask. It held something in its hand. It was another note. It dropped the paper onto the floor and backed away, the grin never fading. The tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. My hands shook as I bent down to pick up the note, my breath hitching in my throat. The paper was damp and cold, the ink smudged but legible. "You invited us in. We're not leaving without you." The lights flickered, and when they came back on, the kitchen was empty. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them, just out of sight, waiting, watching. And they weren't going to wait much longer. I didn't move. My eyes darted around the empty kitchen, every shadow seeming to pulse, to breathe. The note trembled in my hand as I backed toward the counter. My legs felt weak, like they might give out at any second. The air was heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, and with each breath I felt them, closer. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, in the edges of my vision, just waiting for me to let my guard down. The silence broke again. The knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps against the metal of the freezer door this time. I turned toward the sound, knife raised, my breath hitching as I saw the faint outline of handprints pressed against the frost-covered surface. They weren't normal handprints. They were too large, the fingers too long, the shape distorted like something trying to mimic humanity but failing. The knock came again, louder now, reverberating through the kitchen. I took a step back, my heel slipping on a wet patch of floor. I caught myself on the counter, the knife clattering to the ground. The sound echoed, and for a moment everything went still. Then the freezer door began to open. It didn't swing wide like it should have. Instead, it creaked open just an inch at a time, the frost on the edges cracking and hissing as if resisting whatever force was pushing it. Cold mist spilled out, curling along the floor like tendrils, reaching for my feet. I couldn't look away, my eyes locked on the widening gap. Something moved in the mist, slow, deliberate. A hand, pale and thin, reached out, the fingers twitching as they gripped the edge of the door. The nails were black, jagged, curling inward like talons. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The hand disappeared, retreating back into the mist, but the door continued to open, revealing a void darker than the night outside. The mist poured out faster now, rising to my knees, and I stumbled back, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was in there. Then I saw it. Eyes, hundreds of them glowing faintly in the blackness, scattered at impossible angles. They blinked out of sync, some slow, others rapid, but all of them focused on me. I felt their weight, their scrutiny, like claws raking across my skin. A voice echoed from the freezer, layered and distorted, as if 1,000 whispers had merged into one. "You can't hide." The room plunged into darkness as the emergency lights flickered and died. I was blind, the shadows around me pressing closer, colder. My breathing was ragged, my pulse hammering in my ears as I scrambled to find the knife on the floor. Then the lights flickered back on. The freezer door was closed, but the mist remained, swirling at my feet. My knife was gone, but in its place on the floor lay another note. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to touch it, but I had to know. I bent down, my fingers brushing the damp paper, and read the words scrawled across it. "Look outside!" A chill ran down my spine as I turned toward the small frosted window of the back door. My legs felt like lead as I crossed the room, each step an eternity. The glass was fogged over, but something moved on the other side. A silhouette, tall and thin, its head tilted at that impossible angle. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching. Then another shape joined it, and another, until the window was filled with faces. Hollow eyes stared in, their twisted grins pressed against the glass. They began to knock, their hands tapping in unison, the sound growing louder and louder, until it felt like it would split my skull. I staggered back, covering my ears, but the sound wasn't just outside. It was everywhere, echoing through the walls, the floor, my own mind. "Stop!" I screamed, but the knocking only grew more frenzied, like they were trying to force their way in. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the window was empty. The figures were gone. The knocking had stopped. The silence was deafening. I sank to the floor, trembling, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the bell above the diner door jingled. They were inside. The bell's jingle hung in the air like a sinister chime, its echoes seeming to stretch far too long. My blood turned to ice as I stared at the swinging door leading back to the dining area. It creaked slightly, the faintest suggestion of movement. They were here. The silence that followed was unbearable, louder than any scream. My breathing came fast and shallow, and I had to force myself to take slow, deliberate steps toward the door, my legs trembling with each movement. I had to see. I had to know what waited for me on the other side. I pushed the door open just a crack, peeking through. The dining area was transformed. The once bright and sterile fluorescent lights now cast a dim, yellowish glow, flickering erratically. The booths, tables, and counter looked distorted, like they had melted slightly, sagging and misshapen. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners, defying the light. And then there were the figures. They were seated at the booths again, one in each. This time they were no longer still. They fidgeted, their heads jerking in sharp, unnatural motions, their hollow eyes fixed on me. One of them twisted its neck too far, the sound of cracking bones filling the air as it stared upside down. At the far end of the diner, a new figure stood behind the counter. This one was taller than the others, its limbs impossibly long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its face was blank, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth flesh where features should have been. It raised a hand, beckoning me forward with a slow curl of its fingers. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. But my body didn't listen. My feet moved on their own, drawn toward the figure as though an invisible thread had been tied around me, pulling me closer. The other figures began to move as well, their heads swiveling to follow me. Their grins stretched wider, their teeth jagged and yellowed. As I passed each booth, one would reach out, their fingers brushing the edge of my shirt, the sensation like ice water soaking through my skin. By the time I reached the counter, my heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The tall figure didn't move, its featureless face staring down at me. Then, from somewhere deep within its chest, I heard the same distorted voice that had haunted me before. "You belong to us." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, bumping into a booth. The figure reached out, its impossibly long arm extending toward me, its fingers spreading wide. I dropped to the floor, scrambling backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, leave me alone," I screamed, but the figure didn't stop. Its hand hovered above me, the air around it growing colder and colder until frost began to spread across the tiles. Then the bell above the door jingled again. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the entrance in unison. The tall figure recoiled slightly, its arm retracting like a serpent slithering back into its den. I turned toward the door, my chest heaving. A man stood there. Not one of them. He was human, or at least he looked human. His face was rugged and weathered, his eyes sharp and alert. He held a lantern in one hand, its light unnaturally bright, cutting through the diner's oppressive gloom. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped inside, and the figures began to hiss, their distorted bodies writhing in agitation. I don't know what's happening, I stammered, my voice trembling. They won't leave me alone. The man didn't respond immediately. He placed the lantern on the counter, and its light flared, driving the figures back into the shadows. The tall one recoiled further, its featureless face twisting as if in pain. "They've marked you," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "You read the note, didn't you?" I nodded, clutching my arms to keep them from shaking. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." He held up a hand, silencing me. "It doesn't matter. Once you've invited them in, they won't stop until they take what they came for." What do they want?" My voice was barely a whisper. The man's face darkened. "You!" Before I could respond, the lantern's light flickered and the hissing grew louder. The figures began to close in again, their movements frenzied, their hollow eyes burning with a terrible hunger. "We don't have much time," the man said. He pulled something from his coat, a small, weathered book, and began flipping through its pages. "If we don't stop them now, they'll drag you into their world, and you won't come back." Panic surged through me. "What do I do?" He didn't answer, his eyes scanning the book with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The tall figure stepped forward again, its arm extending once more, its fingers curling like claws. The others followed, their movements disjointed and unnatural, their grins splitting wider as they closed the distance. The man looked up, his expression grim. "Run," he said. The diner erupted into chaos. The man's voice was still ringing in my ears as I bolted toward the kitchen, my feet slipping on the slick tiles. Behind me, the sound of the figures closing in was deafening, hisses, distorted whispers, and the unnatural clicking of their limbs against the floor. The lantern's light flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed alive, writhing and stretching toward me like hungry hands. "Keep moving," the man shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. I pushed through the kitchen doors, gasping for air, my vision swimming. The cold mist was thicker now, coiling around my legs as though it were trying to pull me down. The freezer door was open again, wide this time, and the black void inside seemed to pulse, its hundreds of glowing eyes fixed on me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no!" The tall figure glided into the kitchen, its elongated limbs brushing the ceiling. The smaller ones followed, spilling into the room like a tide of shadows, their faces twisted in grotesque mockeries of smiles, their hollow eyes burning with cruel delight. The man burst through the doors behind them, his lantern blazing. The light sent the figures skittering back momentarily, their forms dissolving into smoke before reforming. He held the weathered book in one hand, his voice rising as he read from it in a language I couldn't understand. The air vibrated with the power of his words, and the figures writhed, their hisses turning to screams. "They're tethered to you," he yelled, his eyes locking onto mine. "You have to break the connection or they'll never stop." "How?" I screamed, my voice raw with panic. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small vial of black liquid. "Take this," he said, tossing it to me. I caught it with trembling hands, staring at the inky substance swirling inside. "What is it?" I asked, but there was no time for an answer. The tall figure lunged toward me, its arms snapping out like a whip. I dove out of the way, the claws slicing through the air where I'd just been standing. "Drink it!" the man shouted. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. The liquid inside the vial seemed alive, swirling and pulsing as though it were aware of me. The figures were closing in again, their movements frantic, their distorted limbs clawing at the air. "Do it or you're theirs!" the man bellowed. With a scream, I unscrewed the vial and downed the liquid. It was ice cold, burning my throat as it went down. The moment it hit my stomach, the world seemed to tilt. A searing pain exploded in my chest, and I collapsed to the floor, clutching at my ribs as though they were about to burst. The figures froze, their hollow eyes narrowing. The tall one let out a guttural roar, its smooth face contorting as it recoiled. The pain inside me intensified, spreading through my veins like fire. I screamed again, the sound ripping from my throat as a blinding light erupted from my chest. The light surged outward, filling the room, and the figures dissolved into smoke, their screams echoing into nothingness. The tall figure tried to resist, its claws digging into the floor, but the light consumed it, tearing it apart piece by piece until it vanished. The room fell silent. The mist dissipated, and the oppressive cold lifted. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling. The man knelt beside me, his face lined with exhaustion. "It's over," he said softly. I shook my head. What was that? What were they?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze distant. Finally, he said, "They're not meant to exist in this world. They're remnants, shadows of something ancient that feeds on fear and despair. When you read their note, you gave them a doorway." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "And the vial, what was in it?" "A part of them," he said. "Bound to the light. It was the only way to sever their hold on you." I tried to process his words, but my thoughts were a whirlwind. "What happens now?" He stood, helping me to my feet. "You live, but you're marked now. They'll always be watching, waiting for another crack to slip through. Be careful what you invite into your life." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. The diner was empty now, eerily still. The clock on the wall read 12:01, but it felt like hours had passed. As I followed him toward the door, I glanced back at the counter. The lantern flickered one last time, casting a long shadow across the room. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something move, a shape just out of sight, retreating into the dark. Then the man opened the door, and the cool night air washed over me. The bell jingled as we stepped outside. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded but didn't speak. As he walked away, his lantern's glow faded into the distance, leaving me alone under the pale light of the moon. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent. But as I got into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, I saw a pair of hollow eyes staring back at me from the back seat. Then they were gone.